In the heart of downtown Chicago, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and streets buzzed with life, Tanya Williams was just another face in the crowd. She wasn't anyone special, just a hard-working single mom trying to make ends meet, while raising her teenage daughter. That evening, she was rushing home after spending hours volunteering at a local food bank. Her feet hurt from standing all day, and her mind was still replaying the stories she'd heard from families struggling to put meals on their tables. As she walked past Le Petit Bistrot, one of those fancy restaurants that seemed more like a scene from a movie than real life, something caught her eye. A man stood outside, his shoulders slumped and his face etched with frustration. He wasn't dressed in a suit or tie. Instead, he wore a simple jacket, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing flashy, but nothing dirty or disrespectful either. Still, the hostess at the door was shaking her head firmly, refusing to let him inside. Tanya slowed down, curiosity getting the better of her. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but it didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. The restaurant had a strict dress code, and apparently, this man didn't meet their standards. But there was something about him, something quiet yet dignified, that made Tanya stop completely. He wasn't yelling or throwing a tantrum. Instead, he looked tired, almost defeated, as if this rejection was just one more thing adding to an already heavy load. For a moment, Tanya hesitated. She didn't know this man, and frankly, she had enough problems of her own. What could she possibly do? It wasn't her business, right? But then again, something deep inside her stirred. Maybe it was because she knew what it felt like to be judged based on appearances. As a black woman who had faced her share of unfairness, she understood how small actions could leave big scars. So against her initial instinct to keep moving, she stepped closer. "Excuse me," Tanya said politely, addressing the hostess. "Can I ask what's going on here?" The hostess glanced at her briefly before turning back to the man. "Sir, we have a dress code policy. Unfortunately, you don't meet the requirements." Tanya tilted her head slightly, studying the situation. Sure, the restaurant might have rules, but did they really need to enforce them so rigidly? This wasn't about safety or hygiene, it felt more like snobbery wrapped up in pretty words. Without thinking too much, she turned to the man and asked, "Are you okay?" He blinked, surprised by her question. For a second, he just stared at her, unsure of how to respond, then with a sigh he nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine, just disappointed, I guess." Tanya crossed her arms, feeling a mix of anger and empathy bubbling inside her. Disappointed didn't even begin to cover it. This man wasn't causing trouble or making demands. He simply wanted to enjoy a meal like anyone else. And now, he was being turned away for no good reason. "Well," she said, looking directly at the hostess, "if your dress code is the only issue, maybe you should rethink your priorities. People shouldn't be judged by what they're wearing." The hostess stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, these are our policies. There's nothing I can do." Tanya bit her lip, knowing she wasn't going to win this argument. Policies were policies after all, but that didn't mean she had to walk away and do nothing. Turning back to the man, she offered him a warm smile. "Look, I don't know you, but I can tell you're having a rough day. If you want, I can help you. Find somewhere else to eat. No judgment, no hassle." The man blinked again, this time in disbelief. Was this stranger really offering to help him? After a pause, he managed a small, grateful smile. "That's very kind of you," he said softly. "I appreciate it." And just like that, Tanya found herself leading this man down the street, away from the cold glares of the restaurant staff and toward a cozy little diner tucked between two tall buildings. Little did she know, this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The diner wasn't anything fancy. Just a small, no-frills place with neon signs in the window and the smell of fried food wafting through the air. But it had character. The walls were covered in old black and white photos of Chicago's past, and the menu was scrawled on a chalkboard behind the counter. Tanya pushed open the door, holding it for the man as they stepped inside. The warmth hit them immediately, a welcome change from the chilly evening outside. "Here we are," she said with a smile, gesturing toward an empty booth near the back. Not exactly five-star dining, but the burgers here are pretty good. The man chuckled softly, sliding into the seat across from her. I think after everything that just happened, this is perfect. Tanya nodded, leaning back against the vinyl cushion. For the first time since their encounter, she took a moment to really look at him. His clothes were simple but clean. His face carried lines that hinted at years of hard work, or maybe even hardship. There was something about his eyes, though. They seemed kind, thoughtful, like he'd seen a lot of life but hadn't let it harden him completely. So, Tanya began, breaking the silence. What brings you to Chicago? He hesitated for a second before answering. I'm traveling, sort of, exploring different cities, meeting people, learning stories. He paused, then added with a self-deprecating grin, Guess you could say I got more than I bargained. For tonight? Tanya laughed lightly. Yeah, well, some people have weird ideas about what makes someone worthy of sitting in their restaurant. Her tone was light, but there was a seriousness beneath it. She didn't need to spell out what they both knew, that the rejection he faced likely had less to do with his clothes and more to do with how he looked. Dark skin, casual attire, standing alone. It all added up to unfair assumptions. It wasn't right, and Tanya couldn't stand by without saying something. The waitress came over, dropping off 2 laminated menus. What can I get started for? Y'all? She asked cheerfully. I'll take a coffee, Tanya replied, glancing at the man. And you? Same, he said, closing the menu without looking at it. And maybe one of those cheeseburgers. Looks like the specialty here. Once the waitress left, the conversation picked up again. This time the man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You know, not many people would have done what you did back there. Most folks wouldn't have cared enough to step in. Tanya shrugged, brushing off the compliment. It wasn't a big deal, I don't like seeing people treated unfairly. Doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. Everyone deserves respect. Her words hung in the air between them, simple yet powerful. The man studied her for a moment, as if trying to figure her out. Finally, he nodded. That's rare these days. People talk a lot about fairness, but when it comes down to it, not everyone acts on it. Well, Tanya said, a playful smirk tugging at her lips, maybe I'm just nosy. Or maybe I've been on the other side of things too many times to ignore it now. The man raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The other side? Tanya sighed, leaning back again. She hadn't planned on sharing personal stuff with a stranger, but something about him made her feel comfortable. Let's just say I've dealt with my fair share of judgment. Being a black woman raising a kid on my own, it's not always easy. People see me and assume things before they even know me. So yeah, I guess I've got a soft spot for standing up when something feels wrong. He listened intently, nodding slowly. That must be tough. But it sounds like you handle it with grace. Grace? Tanya chuckled dryly. Some days, sure. Other days I just grit my teeth and keep going. You learn to pick your battles. Their food arrived soon after. Steaming plates of greasy. Goodness, that smelled amazing. They dug in, savoring the flavors while continuing their conversation. The man opened up a little more, telling her about his travels and the kinds of stories he was collecting. He spoke passionately about wanting to highlight everyday heroes, people who did extraordinary things without expecting recognition. You remind me of them, he said between bites. People who see injustice and decide to act even if it's inconvenient. That's inspiring. Tanya felt a blush creep onto her cheeks. Compliments weren't something she heard often, especially not from strangers. I'm nobody special, she insisted. Just doing what feels right. But the man shook his head. Sometimes doing what feels right is exactly what makes someone special. By the time they finished eating, the diner had grown quieter, the dinner rush fading away. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars against the dark sky. As they stood to leave, the man turned to Tanya, his expression sincere. I want to thank you again, for everything, not just helping me find a place to eat, but for reminding me why I started this journey in the first place. People like you give me hope. Tanya smiled, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. Well, I'm glad I could help. Safe travels, okay? They parted ways then, each heading in opposite directions. Tanya walked home, replaying the night in her mind. She hadn't expected much when she stopped to help that man. It was just a small act of kindness. But deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was stirring. Something she couldn't quite put into words yet. Little did she know. Fate had already begun weaving its threads, tying her story to his in ways neither of them could imagine. The next morning, Tanya woke up to the sound of her alarm clock blaring beside her bed. She groaned, reaching out to hit the snooze button, but something stopped her. Her phone screen was lit up with notifications, far more than usual. At first, she thought it might be spam or some random app acting up, but as she scrolled through the messages, her heart skipped a beat. Someone had posted about their encounter at the restaurant. It took her a moment to process what she was seeing. The post described everything: the rejection at the fancy restaurant, her stepping in to help, and even their conversation at the diner. It wasn't just a casual update. It was heartfelt, detailed, and filled with gratitude. What caught her off guard most was how much emphasis the writer placed on her actions. He called her a beacon of kindness and an everyday hero, words that made her squirm a little in her seat. She didn't see herself that way. She'd simply done what felt right. But apparently, others did. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the comments. Hundreds of people had chimed in, praising her courage and calling out the injustice of the situation. Some shared their own experiences of being judged unfairly because of how they looked or dressed. Others thanked her for standing up when so many would have stayed silent. A few even tagged local news outlets, urging them to cover the story. Tanya sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. Part of her wanted to laugh it off. It was just one small act, after all. But another part of her couldn't deny the weight of it. People were inspired. They were talking about fairness, empathy, and standing up for what's right. And somehow she had become the center of that conversation. Later that day, as she got ready for work, her phone buzzed nonstop. Friends and acquaintances were texting her, asking if the story was true. Even her teenage daughter, Mia, walked into the kitchen looking confused. "Mom, are you famous now?" she asked, holding up her own phone. Tanya laughed nervously, tying her hair back into a bun. "Famous? No, I'm not famous. Someone just wrote about what happened last night." "But everyone's talking about it," Mia exclaimed, scrolling through social media. "People are saying you're a hero." "A hero?" Tanya shook her head, grabbing her bag. "I don't know about that. I just helped someone who needed it. That's all." But deep down she knew this was bigger than her. Social media had a way of amplifying voices, and hers, or rather the stranger's account of her actions, was resonating with people in ways she hadn't anticipated. By lunchtime, local news stations started reaching out, asking for interviews. One reporter even showed up at the food bank where she volunteered, hoping to catch her on camera. Tanya politely declined, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and honestly, she didn't want to be. Still, the ripple effects kept coming. A nonprofit organization working to combat discrimination contacted her, offering her a paid position as a community liaison. They explained that her story had inspired them to expand their outreach efforts, and they believed she'd be the perfect person to lead the charge. At first, Tanya hesitated. She already juggled so much between volunteering, parenting, and her part-time job. Could she really take on something new? That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Mia, Tanya weighed her options. "What do you think, kiddo?" she asked, stirring sugar into her tea. "Should I go for it?" Mia shrugged, twirling a strand of her hair around her finger. "Why not? You're always helping people anyway. Maybe this is your chance to do it on a bigger scale." Tanya smiled faintly. Leave it to her daughter to cut straight to the point. Still, Mia's words stuck with her. Maybe this was an opportunity to turn a single moment of kindness into something lasting, something meaningful. A week later, Tanya found herself sitting across from the man who had written the viral post. They met at a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place where soft jazz played in the background and the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. When she arrived, he stood up, smiling warmly. "I owe you an apology," he said as they settled into their seats. "I didn't mean to cause such a stir. I wanted to share your story. I hope it hasn't been too overwhelming." Tanya waved him off, laughing lightly. "Overwhelming? Sure. But it's not your fault. Honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all." They spent the next hour talking, diving deeper into each other's lives. He told her more about his travels and the book he was writing, a collection of stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Tanya listened intently, intrigued by his passion for storytelling. When he mentioned wanting to include her in the book, she hesitated. "Me?" she asked, surprised. "Why me? I didn't do anything special." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That's exactly why. You didn't think twice about helping me. You saw something unfair and decided to act. That's powerful, especially in a world where so many people look the other way." Tanya mulled it over, chewing on her bottom lip. On one hand, the idea of being featured in a book felt surreal. On the other hand, she couldn't deny the potential impact. If sharing her story could inspire others to stand up for what's right, wasn't that worth it? Finally, she nodded. "Okay, let's do it." As they parted ways again, Tanya felt a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling inside her. This was uncharted territory, new challenges, new responsibilities. But she also felt a spark of hope. For years, she'd worked tirelessly behind the scenes, helping others without expecting recognition. Now, fate seemed to be handing her a megaphone, giving her a platform to amplify the causes she cared about. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. Over the coming months, her life would transform in ways she never imagined. Opportunities would knock on her door, friendships would blossom, and her daughter would watch proudly as her mom became a symbol of resilience and compassion. But for now, Tanya walked home under the glow of streetlights, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She may have started as an ordinary woman doing an ordinary thing, but sometimes, ordinary acts can ignite extraordinary change. As the weeks rolled by, Tanya's life began to shift in ways she could never have predicted. The initial wave of attention from the viral post hadn't died down, it had only grown stronger. People were hungry for stories like hers, tales of everyday kindness and quiet courage in a world that often felt chaotic and divided. Local news outlets weren't the only ones reaching out anymore. National platforms started calling too. Talk shows, podcasts, and even magazines wanted to feature her. At first, Tanya turned most of them down, feeling uneasy about stepping into the spotlight. But as time went on, she realized something important. This wasn't just about her. It was about the message. Every interview request, every article, every social media comment was an opportunity to talk about the bigger picture, the need for empathy, fairness, and action in the face of injustice. So slowly but surely, Tanya began saying yes. She sat down with reporters, sharing her thoughts on why standing up matters, no matter how small the act might seem. She spoke candidly about her own struggles as a single mom, a Black woman, and someone who'd faced judgment countless times in her life. Her honesty struck a chord with people. They saw themselves in her story, not because they'd all been rejected by fancy restaurants, but because they understood what it meant to feel unseen or undervalued. The man who had written the viral post stayed in touch, regularly checking in to see how she was handling everything. Their conversations became a source of comfort for Tanya during moments when the pressure felt overwhelming. "You're doing great," he told her one evening, over the phone. "People are listening because you're real. You're not trying to be perfect, you're just being you." His words gave her strength, especially when criticism inevitably came her way. Not everyone was supportive. Some trolls online accused her of seeking fame or exaggerating the incident at the restaurant. Others questioned whether helping one person really made a difference. "Why didn't you focus on bigger issues?" one commenter wrote sarcastically. "Like racism or poverty?" Tanya read those comments late at night, sitting alone in her dimly lit living room. Each harsh word stung, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Was she doing enough? Should she have done more? These questions swirled in her mind, keeping her awake long after Mia had gone to bed. But then she remembered something the man had said during one of their talks. Criticism comes with visibility. Don't let it silence you. And so, instead of letting the negativity drag her down, Tanya used it as fuel. If people thought she should tackle bigger issues, fine, she'd show them she could. With her new role at the nonprofit, she threw herself into advocating for systemic change. She organized workshops, led discussions, and partnered with local leaders to address discrimination in housing, education, and employment. Every initiative she spearheaded carried the same message. Kindness starts with individuals, but real change requires collective effort. Her daughter, Mia, noticed the toll it was taking. One afternoon, as Tanya sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and notes, Mia plopped down across from her. "Mom, you've been working nonstop," she said, concern etched on her face. "When was the last time you took a break?" Tanya glanced up, surprised by her daughter's observation. "I'm okay, sweetheart, just busy." "Busy doesn't mean okay," Mia shot back, crossing her arms. "You're always running around trying to fix everything for everyone else. What about you?" For a moment, Tanya didn't know how to respond. Mia was right. She had been pouring all her energy into helping others, neglecting herself in the process. It wasn't healthy, and deep down she knew it. But how could she stop? There was always another meeting to attend, another speech to give, another problem to solve. Seeing her mom's hesitation, Mia softened her tone. "I get it, Mom. You want to make things better. But if you burn out, who's going to keep fighting for all those causes you care about?" Her words hit home. That night, Tanya forced herself to step away from her work and spend some quality time with Mia. They ordered pizza, watched a cheesy movie, and laughed until their sides hurt. For the first time in weeks, Tanya allowed herself to relax, to exist without worrying about deadlines or expectations. And while it didn't magically erase her stress, it reminded her of why she was doing all of this in the first place: to create a better future for her daughter and others like her. Amidst the whirlwind of interviews, advocacy work, and personal reflection, Tanya received an email from the man that made her pause. He had finished drafting the chapter about her for his upcoming book, and he wanted her feedback before sending it off to publishers. Attached to the email was a PDF file labeled Chapter 7. With a mix of excitement and nerves, Tanya opened the document and began reading. From the very first paragraph, she was floored. The way he described their encounter, her stepping in at the restaurant, their meal at the diner, the bond they formed, it was beautiful. But what truly moved her were the sections where he highlighted her resilience and determination. He didn't just focus on that one night. He wove in snippets of her life, painting a picture of a woman who had faced countless challenges yet refused to give up. By the time she reached the end, tears were streaming down her face. "This is incredible," she whispered to herself, clutching her phone. She called him immediately, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied warmly. "It's your story, Tanya. All I did was tell it. And maybe that was true. But having someone else recognize her journey, validate her struggles, and celebrate her victories meant more than she could put into words." For years, Tanya had carried the weight of her responsibilities silently, believing that her sacrifices were simply part of life. Now she was beginning to understand that her story mattered, not just to her but to others who needed to hear it. The book, titled Unsung Heroes, was set to release in 6 months. In the meantime, Tanya continued balancing her roles as a mother, advocate, and now reluctant public figure. Each day brought new challenges but also new opportunities. She learned to navigate the highs and lows with grace, leaning on her support system when things got tough. Most importantly, she held on to the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark monumental change. Little did she know, however, that fate still had surprises in store. As the launch date for the book approached, whispers of a special announcement began circulating. When the day finally arrived, Tanya would discover just how far-reaching the impact of her actions truly was, and how deeply intertwined her life had become with the lives of those she touched along the way. The months leading up to the release of Unsung Heroes were a blur for Tanya. Between her advocacy work, media appearances, and preparing for the book launch, she barely had time to catch her breath. But despite the chaos, there was a sense of purpose driving her forward, a feeling that all the pieces of her life were finally coming together in ways she never expected. The man who wrote the book stayed in constant contact, updating her on its progress and sharing snippets from early reviews. Publishers loved it, calling it a timely reminder of the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. Readers who got advance copies couldn't stop talking about Chapter 7, the chapter dedicated entirely to Tanya's story. It wasn't just her encounter at the restaurant or their conversation at the diner that resonated with them. It was the way the writer captured her humanity, her struggles, her resilience, her quiet determination. It all came alive on the page, inspiring readers to reflect on their own lives and choices. But as much as Tanya appreciated the praise, she couldn't shake the weight of expectation settling over her shoulders. The closer they got to the book's release date, the more pressure she felt to live up to the image people had built around her. She wasn't just Tanya Williams anymore, the single mom volunteering at a food bank. Now, she was seen as a symbol of hope, kindness, and activism. Strangers approached her in grocery stores, thanking her for being brave enough to stand up when others wouldn't. Friends and acquaintances urged her to take on bigger projects, run for office, or start her own foundation. Everyone seemed to have an idea of what she should do next. At first, Tanya tried to embrace it all. She attended events, gave speeches, and worked tirelessly to keep pushing for systemic change through her nonprofit role. But the harder she pushed herself, the more drained she became. Some nights she'd sit alone in her bedroom staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was doing enough, or worse, if she was losing sight of why she started this journey in the first place. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Mia walked into her room without knocking. "Mom," she said firmly, sitting down beside her, "you're running yourself ragged." Tanya sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." "No, you're not fine," Mia shot back, her voice tinged with frustration. "You think I don't notice? You've been working non-stop since this whole thing blew up. When was the last time you did something just for you?" Tanya opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Mia was right. She hadn't taken a break in months. Even simple pleasures like reading a book or taking a long bath felt like luxuries she didn't deserve. Everything revolved around helping others, fighting injustice, and proving herself worthy of the attention she'd received. But deep down, she knew Mia was onto something. If she kept going at this pace, she'd burn out completely. "I'll try to slow down," Tanya promised, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I promise." Mia nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "Good. Because we need you here, not just as some big-shot activist, but as my mom." Despite her best intentions, slowing down proved easier said than done. As the book launch drew nearer, invitations poured in from all corners of the country. Universities wanted her to speak at graduation ceremonies. Community organizations begged her to lead workshops. Even corporations reached out asking her to consult on diversity initiatives. Each request came with promises of impact and visibility, making it hard for Tanya to say no. Then one afternoon, while sorting through yet another stack of emails, she stumbled across a message that stopped her cold. It was from the writer, and the subject line read, "A special announcement." Her heart raced as she clicked it open. Inside, he explained that he'd decided to use part of the proceeds from Unsung Heroes to fund a scholarship program for young women like Mia. He called it the Everyday Courage Scholarship, designed to support girls who showed grit, compassion, and leadership potential, but lacked the resources to pursue their dreams. And he wanted Tanya's blessing to name it after her. Tanya stared at the screen, tears welling up in her eyes. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. A scholarship, named after her? For years, she'd worried about how she'd afford college for Mia once the time came. Now, thanks to this unexpected gift, other families might not have to face Those same fears. She called him immediately, her voice shaking with emotion. Are you serious? This is incredible. It's the least I can do, he replied warmly. You inspired me to write this book, Tanya. You've inspired so many people. This is just a small way of giving back. Small? To Tanya, it felt enormous. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to pause and truly absorb everything that had happened. From stepping in at that restaurant to standing on stages speaking to crowds, every decision she'd made along the way had led her here, to a moment where her actions were creating opportunities not just for herself, but for others. When the book officially launched, Tanya found herself surrounded by cheering crowds at a packed event downtown. People lined up for hours to get their copies signed, many of them sharing how her story had touched their lives. One woman tearfully recounted how Tanya's example had given her the courage to stand up against workplace discrimination. A teenage girl shyly admitted she'd started volunteering at her local shelter because of Tanya's advocacy work. Each story reinforced what Tanya already knew. Change didn't happen overnight, but every act of kindness planted seeds that could grow into something beautiful. After the event, as she sat in the quiet solitude of her car, Tanya reflected on how far she'd come. She thought about the night she'd met the writer, how she'd simply followed her gut and helped someone in need without expecting anything in return. Back then, she'd been focused on surviving, getting through each day with enough energy left over to care for Mia. Now she was thriving, using her platform to lift others up and create pathways for future generations. But as grateful as she was for the recognition and opportunities, Tanya knew this wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about connection. Every person she'd met, every life she'd touched reminded her that none of us are meant to walk this world alone. We're meant to lean on each other, to lift each other up when times get tough. That's what true courage looked like. Not grand gestures or heroic feats, but showing up when it mattered most. As she drove home under the glow of streetlights, Tanya felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the road ahead would still be challenging. There would be critics, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Whether it was Mia cheering her on, strangers sharing their stories, or the writer turning gratitude into action, Tanya had built a community around her, a network of people committed to making the world a little kinder, a little fairer, and a lot brighter. And maybe that was the greatest reward of all.